The suitcase hit the porch first, then the cardboard box of metals, spilling ribbons and brass across the frozen ground while the old man stood in the doorway of the house he'd paid for and watched his own daughter tell him he couldn't stay. "It's not personal, Dad," she said, not meeting his eyes, her husband a shadow behind her in the warm hall. "We just need the space." He did not understand, not really, but he bent his stiff knees and gathered the metals back into the box one by one, the Purple Heart, the Bronze Star. That was Frank Delaney, 76 years old, 40 years of a life reduced to what would fit in a Buick. He did not argue. He did not beg. He loaded the car and drove off into a gray December morning with nowhere to go, discarded by the country he had bled for. He drove for 2 days. He slept in the car the first night in a grocery store parking lot, the engine running for heat until he worried about the gas, and then off, shivering under an army blanket that still smelled faintly of a barracks 50 years gone. He had 400 and change in his checking account and a pension that wouldn't clear until the 1st, and he was too proud to call the 2 army buddies he still traded Christmas cards with. Because a man did not call his friends to say his own child had put him out on the porch like a bag of trash. He thought about his wife, Eleanor, dead 6 years now, and was almost glad she hadn't lived to see it. She'd have never let it happen, of course. The house had been Eleanor's dream as much as his, bought with 30 years of his soldiers' pay and her careful saving. And when she passed, he'd signed it over to their daughter Karen without a second thought. Because that was what you did. You gave your children a foothold in a hard world. He'd kept only a room in it and a promise, spoken over Eleanor's grave, that he'd be no trouble to anyone. He'd kept that promise. He'd washed his own dishes and stayed out of the way and paid toward the groceries out of his pension. And it had bought him exactly nothing when Karen's husband decided the old man in the back bedroom was one mouth too many. He did not hate her for it. That surprised him, in the long cold hours of driving. He was hurt in a way that went down to the bone, a hurt no amount of driving could put behind him. But he did not hate her, and he suspected that was Eleanor's doing, some softness she'd worn into him over 40 years of marriage that even this could not scrape away. A younger man might have raged. A younger man might have said the cruel true things and slammed the door. But Frank had buried enough people and enough years to know that rage was just grief that hadn't found its feet yet. And so he drove, and he grieved, and he let the miles carry the worst of it off into the gray behind him. On the second day, he came through a shrinking mountain town where the mill had closed and half the storefronts were papered over. And taped to the window of a shuttered realty office, he saw a hand-lettered sign, County Tax Auction, Delinquent Properties, Today. He almost drove past. Something made him stop. The auction was held in the back of the county building, a dozen folding chairs and a bored clerk reading off parcel numbers to a nearly empty room. Most of the lots were worthless scraps, a flooded quarter-acre, a burned-out lot nobody wanted. The kind of properties that ended up at a tax auction because not even the bank would take them. Frank sat in the back with his hat in his hands and no real intention of bidding on anything, only glad, for a moment, to be somewhere warm and out of the car. But near the end the clerk read off a cabin, one room, up on Cutter's Ridge, condemned, back taxes owed of $17, and when nobody raised a hand, Frank, who had not planned to raise his, heard his own voice say $17, and just like that the cabin was his. The clerk looked at him like he was simple. "You know that place is falling down, mister," he said. "Been empty 30 years. No power, no water, roads half washed out. Fella that had it before was some old hermit, never came to town, died up there alone as far as anyone knows. Nobody's wanted it since." "I've slept in worse," Frank said, which was true. He counted out the $17 in bills and coins onto the clerk's desk, signed where he was told to sign, and walked out into the cold with a deed in his pocket, and the first thing that had felt like his own in 6 years. The road up Cutter's Ridge was a rutted track that his old Buick barely managed, the undercarriage scraping over frozen ruts, and when he finally came around the last bend and saw the cabin, he understood the clerk's pity. It sagged. The porch had rotted through in one corner, the chimney had lost half its stones, and the single window was boarded over with gray warped plywood. But it stood on a rise with a view down the whole valley, the kind of view a rich man would pay a fortune for, and the walls were built of squared logs a foot thick that no cheap modern house could match, notched and fitted by hands that had known exactly what they were doing. And something in Frank, some part of him that had been dead since the porch and the cardboard box, stirred a little at the sight of it. It was his. $17, and it was his, and no daughter and no son-in-law could ever tell him to get out of it. He spent the first night on the floor in his sleeping bag, and in the morning he began to clean. He was slow, and his back was bad, and the arthritis in his hands made every task twice the work it should have been, but he had spent a lifetime doing hard things with a body that hurt, and he found he still knew how. He swept out 30 years of leaves and mouse nests. He pried the plywood off the window and let in the light. He hauled water up from the creek in a bucket and boiled it on a camp stove. And by the end of that first week the one room was livable, barely, and Frank Delaney slept under a roof that belonged to him for the first time in his life. There was a strange peace in the work. In the army he had learned that a man could survive nearly anything if he had a task in front of him and the discipline to do it, and the cabin gave him both. He rose with the light. He worked until his body told him to stop. He ate simple food off a camp stove and slept hard for the first time in years, and the great black weight that had ridden on his chest since the porch began, day by day, to lift. He was still a discarded old man on a falling down mountain. But he was a discarded old man with something to do, and he had learned long ago that this was the whole difference between living and merely waiting to die. It was while pulling up a section of rotted floorboard near the back wall, planning to patch it before he put his foot through it, that his pry bar caught on something that shouldn't have been there. A seam. A straight line in the dirt beneath the boards, too straight to be natural. He brushed the dirt away with his hands, and there, set into a concrete pad that had no business being under a mountain cabin, was a steel door. A vault. Flush with the ground, its surface scarred and rusted, a heavy combination dial in the center gone brown with age. Frank sat back on his heels and stared at it a long time. Whoever built this cabin, whoever had squared those foot-thick logs by hand, had poured a concrete vault into the earth beneath it and hidden it under the floor, and then for 30 years, nobody had known it was there. A man did not go to that kind of trouble to hide firewood. A man went to that kind of trouble to hide something he was afraid of, or something someone else was afraid of, and either way it made the hair on Frank's arms stand up in a way he hadn't felt since he wore a younger man's uniform. He tried the dial. It was frozen with rust and age, and turning it did nothing. He tried to pry the edge of the door, and it didn't give a hair. Whatever was inside had been sealed up tight and left, and Frank spent the better part of 3 days working at it, soaking the dial in the last of his penetrating oil, tapping the mechanism with a hammer the way he'd learned to coax a stuck rifle bolt in weather cold enough to freeze the action solid. He talked to it, the way old men talk to stubborn things, cursing it and coaxing it by turns. He nearly gave up twice. But he had nothing else to do and nowhere else to be, and there is a particular stubbornness that comes to a man who has been told by everyone he loves that he is finished, a refusal that has nothing to do with the task in front of him and everything to do with proving, even just to himself, that his hands can still make the world give up something it doesn't want to. On the third evening, with the light going gold through the unboarded window, the dial suddenly turned, all the way around, and something deep inside the door went clunk, and the great steel door groaned up on its hinges, as if it had been waiting 60 years for exactly this old man to open it. Inside was not treasure, not the way the word means in stories. There was no gold, but there were papers, stacks of them, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed in metal boxes against the damp, and there were 3 long wooden crates stenciled with markings Frank recognized instantly, because he'd spent 20 years around exactly these kinds of markings. Military. Old military. And there was a leather logbook on top, and a letter, sealed in a waxed envelope, addressed in a shaking old hand to whoever finds this. Frank's hands, steady through 50 years of things that would have shaken younger men apart, trembled a little as he lifted the letter out. He carried it to the window where the last light was, and he lowered himself into the one chair he'd salvaged, and he opened it carefully, the wax cracking away in flakes, and he read it by the last of the daylight, and what it told him changed everything he thought he understood about the cabin he'd bought for $17. The letter was written by a man named Josiah Kane, who had built the cabin with his own hands in 1946, home from a war that Frank's own father's generation had fought. But Josiah Kane had not come home empty-handed. He had come home having witnessed something, some operation at the end of the war that powerful men wanted buried, and he had come home with the proof of it, documents and photographs and a chain of orders that named names, and he had spent the rest of his long life hidden on this ridge guarding it, because the moment he handed it over he was a dead man, and the moment he destroyed it, the truth died with him. I am 91 years old as I write this, the letter said. I have outlived every man who wanted me silenced, but I do not trust their sons. I have kept this because a thing that is true should not be allowed to die just because powerful men find it inconvenient. If you are reading this, I am gone, and it is yours now, the burden and the choice both. Do with it what your conscience tells you. I could not bring myself to destroy it, and I could not bring myself to release it while it would only have gotten me killed. Perhaps you will be braver than I was. Perhaps the world has changed. God help you if it hasn't. Frank sat in the dark a long while after that, the letter in his hands, the open vault at his feet, and felt the strangest thing settle over him, which was purpose. For the first time since the porch, since the cardboard box, since his daughter would not meet his eyes, Frank Delaney had something to do that mattered. Not to him alone. To more than him. An old soldier who had spent 6 years believing his usefulness had ended with his career and his wife's death, sat on the floor of a mountain cabin and understood that a dead stranger had handed him, across the years, a reason to still be alive. He put the letter down. He looked out the window at the valley going blue with dusk, and for the first time in longer than he could remember he was not tired, not defeated, not waiting for the days to run out. He was ready. He slept that night better than he had in years, warm under his army blanket with the vault closed again beneath the floor, at peace with the ridge and the quiet, and the sense that he had, at last, been given something worth guarding. He didn't know yet how much trouble it would bring to his door. If you're moved by Frank's story so far, take a moment to subscribe, because what this old soldier does next is something nobody in that valley saw coming. He spent a week reading everything in the vault by lamplight, slowly, the way he did everything now, and the more he read the more his old soldier's blood ran cold. Josiah Kane had not been a crank or a dreamer. The documents were real, or real enough that Frank, who had carried orders like these in his own hands decades ago, could tell the genuine article from a forgery. Names he half recognized, families that had gone on to build fortunes and dynasties, the kind of names that ended up on buildings and ballots. And the thing they had done at the end of that old war, the thing Josiah Kane had watched and could not forget, was the kind of thing that did not have a statute of limitations in the heart even if it had one in the law. He read the logbook last, and it was the worst of all, because it was not orders and photographs but a young man's plain account of what he had seen, written in Josiah Kane's own hand in the weeks after it happened, before the fear had time to make him careful. Frank read it twice. He had seen ugly things in his own war, things he'd never spoken of to Eleanor or anyone, and he recognized in Josiah's shaking sentences the particular weight of a man carrying something he was never meant to survive knowing. 60 years that man had carried it alone on this ridge. 60 years, guarding a truth that could have gotten him killed any day of it, waiting for someone to hand it to. Frank was careful. 50 years in and around the army had taught him that a man holding something dangerous does not wave it around. He made copies the slow way, at the library in town, feeding coins into an old machine, and he mailed one set to a journalist whose name he'd seen on a story about buried government records, and he put another in a safe deposit box 2 counties over, and he told not one living soul what he had found. But small towns talk, and a stranger who buys a condemned cabin and then starts spending his days at the library copying old documents is a thing that gets noticed. Frank felt the shift before he understood it. The clerk at the hardware store went quiet when he came in. A truck he didn't know drove slow past the base of his road one evening and did not stop. He noticed, the way an old soldier notices, that he was being watched, and he checked the loads in the shotgun he'd bought in town, and he kept the vault closed and he waited. Because he'd learned that when trouble is coming the worst thing a man can do is pretend it isn't. And then, on a cold morning in January, a car came up the washed-out track that no ordinary car should have attempted, and a man in a good coat got out, smiling, and called Frank by his name though Frank had never told it to him. "Mr. Delaney," the man said. "My name's Preston. I represent some people with a historical interest in this property. We understand old Josiah Kane lived here. We'd like to buy the place from you. Generously." Frank stood on his rotted porch with his coffee going cold in his hand and looked at the man's soft, clean hands and his hard, flat eyes and understood that the trouble Josiah Kane had guarded against for 60 years had finally found its way back up the ridge. He'd known men like Preston in the service, not the ones who did the killing but the ones who arranged it, who wore good coats and never got mud on their shoes and spoke of terrible things in the flat, pleasant voice of a man discussing the weather. They were, in Frank's long experience, the most dangerous kind, because they felt nothing at all. "Place isn't for sale," Frank said. "Everything's for sale," Preston said, still smiling. "We're prepared to offer you $200,000. For a cabin you paid, what was it, $17 for? That's a good return, Mr. Delaney. That's a comfortable rest of your life. A man your age, in your situation, put out by his own family, I'd think you'd jump at it." The knowledge of exactly how much this stranger knew about him, about the porch and the box of medals and the daughter who wouldn't meet his eyes, landed in Frank's chest like a cold stone. They had looked into him. They had found the softest, most shameful thing in his life and laid it on the table between them like a card, to let him know they could reach anywhere. But Frank had been shot at by men far more frightening than this soft-handed messenger, and he did not let a flicker of it show on his face. "I'll think on it," Frank said, which was a lie, and Preston knew it was a lie, and both of them knew the other knew. "You do that," Preston said. "But don't take too long. Old cabins like this, up here all alone, they're not safe. Fires. Accidents. A man could fall through a rotten porch and lie there for weeks before anyone came looking. If anyone came looking at all. And there it was, the same threat Josiah Kane had lived under for 60 years, spoken plain on Frank's own porch, and something in Frank that had gone soft and defeated on his daughter's doorstep went hard again, the way it used to go hard before a fight. The grief and the shame of the porch, the box of medals, the long cold drive, all of it burned off in an instant and left behind the man he had been before age and loss had worn him down. The man who had led scared boys up hills under fire, and brought most of them back. "I've been threatened by professionals, son," Frank said quietly. "You're an amateur. Get off my ridge." Preston's smile finally dropped, and he looked at Frank for a long cold moment, and then he got back in his car and backed carefully down the ruined track, and Frank watched him go and knew that the man would be back, and that next time he would not come smiling, and that one old veteran alone on a mountain was not going to be able to stand against whatever came next by strength alone. So Frank did what he had always done best. He did not wait to be attacked. He prepared. He called the 2 army buddies he'd been too proud to call before, and this time pride didn't enter into it. He told them everything, the porch and the cabin and the vault and the letter and the soft-handed man with the flat eyes, and there was a silence on the line, and then old Ray Boudreau said only, "Give me 11 hours. Ray, who'd been a combat engineer, who'd cleared mines and built bridges under fire, and whose own children never called him either, drove 11 hours through the night, and arrived the next morning with a truck full of tools, and a look in his eye that 50 years of civilian life hadn't softened. He walked the ridge once, slow, reading the ground the way he used to, and then he went to work. And Tom Whitcomb, who'd spent his career in military intelligence and knew people who knew people, made some quiet phone calls from his kitchen table 3 states away. Tom couldn't drive anymore, his eyes were going, but Tom's mind was the sharpest weapon any of them had ever carried. And within 2 days he had reached the same journalist Frank had mailed his copies to, had vouched for the documents with the weight of a man whose words still meant something in certain buildings in Washington, and had arranged a quiet insurance policy that a lone old man on a mountain never could have managed on his own. If anything happened to Frank, Tom made sure, the whole thing would detonate in every newspaper in the country the same week. "They're not going to expect this," Ray said on the 3rd evening, the 3 of them together at last, 2 in the flesh and Tom on the speakerphone, the way they hadn't been together in 30 years. "They think they're coming for a scared old man alone in the dark." "Let them think it," Frank said. "Feels good, doesn't it?" Tom said through the phone. Being useful again. None of them answered, because they didn't have to. 3 old men that the world had set aside, that families and time and their own bodies had told in 100 small ways were finished, sat on a mountain in the cold and felt, for the first time in years, the clean hard purpose of men with a job to do and each other to do it with. They came for the cabin on a moonless night, 3 of them, just as Frank had known they would, and they came expecting a frightened old man alone. They left their vehicle at the bottom of the ridge and came up quiet and on foot, professionals, spread out the way men do when they mean to surround a place. And if the man they'd come for had been what they thought he was, it would have been finished in a matter of minutes. But what they found was Ray Boudreau's tripwires and floodlights snapping on across the whole ridge, turning night into blinding day, freezing them in the open like deer on a road. What they found was 2 old soldiers who had not forgotten a single thing the army taught them, positioned exactly where the light would drive an intruder, and Frank Delaney standing on his porch with a shotgun and a phone already dialed to a state trooper Tom's contact had sent up the mountain an hour before and hidden in the tree line. It was over in minutes, and it was not close. The men who'd come to make an old veteran disappear found themselves face down in the frost with the troopers' cuffs on their wrists, and their own threats recorded on a device Tom had planted at the base of the road. And by dawn they were in the back of a state cruiser, and the men who'd sent them were learning, for the first time in 60 years, what it felt like to be the ones afraid. The journalist ran the story 3 weeks later, and it did not stay a small story for long. The documents Josiah Kane had guarded for 60 years, that Frank Delaney had found under the floor of a $17 cabin, named names that people knew, and the proof was too solid and too public now to bury. There were hearings. There were resignations. Reporters made the long drive up the washed-out track to stand on Frank's rebuilt porch and ask him how it felt, and Frank told them the truth, which was that it wasn't his story, it was Josiah Kane's, and that all he'd done was finish a job an old man had started before Frank was even out of uniform. Old people in that valley and beyond it, who'd carried their own small knowledge of those families for a lifetime and been too frightened to speak, began to come forward once they saw one man hadn't lived, and the thing snowballed the way the truth does once the fear that holds it down finally breaks. A university took possession of the full archive so that no fire or accident could ever make it disappear again, and Josiah Kane, dead and forgotten on his ridge, became at last what he had always deserved to be, which was a man remembered for his conscience instead of his silence. Frank Delaney did not get rich. He hadn't done it for that, and he turned down the offers that came later, from people who wanted to buy his story the way Preston had wanted to buy his silence. What he got instead was something he valued more. Ray Boudreau, whose own kids never called, sold his empty house in the city and moved into a second cabin the 3 of them built on the ridge that spring, board by board, arguing the whole time like they were young men again. Tom came out for the summers, his failing eyes no obstacle to sitting on a porch in the mountain air with the only 2 men left alive who knew what he'd been. 3 old soldiers who'd been discarded, each in his own way by families and by time, built themselves a place on a mountain where they belonged to something again, and the $17 cabin with the empty vault beneath it became the center of it. His daughter called eventually. She'd seen the news the way the whole country had. She said she was proud of him, and she said she was sorry, and she asked in a careful voice whether he might want to come back and stay with them after all, now that things were different. Frank listened to the whole thing, standing in the doorway of the cabin with the phone to his ear and the Valley Gold below him, and he was quiet a moment, and then he told her he forgave her, because he did, because he'd learned in a hard life that carrying that kind of thing only poisons the one who carries it. But he told her he had a home now, one that no one could put him out of, and friends who'd driven through the night when he called, and a reason to get up in the morning that was all his own. He told her she was welcome to visit any time, and that he'd like to see the grandchildren, and he meant that too. And then he wished her well, and he hung up the phone, and he walked out onto the porch he'd rebuilt with his own 2 hands. The valley spread out gold below him in the evening light. Ray was splitting wood by the second cabin, cursing cheerfully at a knot in the grain. Somewhere down the ridge a bird was calling, and the smell of wood smoke drifted up from the chimney he'd rebuilt stone by stone. And Frank Delaney, 76 years old, who had been thrown away with a box of medals on a cold December morning, stood on land that was his and understood that the cheapest thing he had ever bought had given him back the one thing his own family had taken, which was the knowledge that his life still mattered, that an old man discarded is not the same as an old man finished, and that sometimes the truest home a person ever finds is the one they build with their own bruised hands after. Everyone in the world has told them they no longer have a place in it,